morning. Today's the big day. We're going to be on a train for 54 hours. Let's go. And we're off. Now seems like a good time to explain what I'm doing. There's this train called the California Zephyr, which travels across most of America in one mammoth journey of 3,900 kilometers. Starting in Chicago, where I am based, it crosses through Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California, before arriving in San Francisco at the other end of the journey. I'm planning to take the entire trip in coach class. First, I had to get to the train station by, train. It proved quite difficult as there were delays, but I did make it in the end. After waiting in a train station way too crowded for Corona times, I eagerly boarded the train and was ushered to the last coach car, which would be my home for the next 3 days. Leaving Chicago, I felt quite pleased with the generous legroom and the cushioned seat, and, of course, the excessive amount of snacks I had bought in a shopping spree the night before. Soon we were approaching our first stop of the journey, Naperville, Illinois, just 30 miles out of the city, in amazingly dreary weather. Day 1, consisting of crossing the fields and forests of Illinois, didn't bring all too much excitement, mostly just settling into my new life aboard the train, overhearing conversations and trying to guess where the Amish people who were traveling with me were headed. A middle-aged man sitting diagonally behind me told a woman, a stranger, his reason for being on the train. He said that there were no jobs left in Syracuse, the town in upstate New York that he was coming from, and he had found it impossible to survive there. Since the pandemic struck, he had been working on and off, such as in a warehouse, but he was now off to Nevada, and had been traveling for 2 weeks. As long as I'm going to immediately get a job when I arrive, I'll be fine, he said. Later, I came to talk to him directly for a bit, during which he outlined for me his hatred of billionaires, greed, and that the US is an overrated country that is beset by egoism and tortures people on the battlefield just like everyone else does. Outside, it was getting dark as we approached Iowa and got ready for our first night aboard the California Zephyr.
Once we cross this river, we're in Burlington. We're just the border of Illinois and Iowa right here.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
That one is Iowa?
That one was Iowa, and it brought us a few hours of nighttime cruising to catch some rest, with the exception of a brief stop in Omaha, Nebraska. Day 2 started with a beautiful sunrise somewhere over the incredible flatness of Nevada, before a few hours and a few past oil refineries later, we started rolling into our first stop for the day, Denver, Colorado. Our previously mostly empty train filled up quite a bit here, and I decided to move forward to the panorama car to get a good seat for our ascent into the Rocky Mountains. Soon we found ourselves winding our way up said mountains, slowly but surely leaving behind Denver's grassland for more alpine terrain. Steppe gave way to dark green forests and cottages, and soon we encountered the first patches of snow. The patches soon gave way to a continuous thick snow cover as we continued to climb at a leisurely 30 or so miles an hour up toward the ski resorts of Colorado. Judging by the gear, the destination of many of the travelers who had crammed on board in Denver. The panorama car was a nice addition to the train, although I had been displaced to sit in one of the corners by a large family. The comfortable chairs and big windows made for a sublime viewing experience of the Colorado landscape. Almost reminded me of home in Austria a little bit. Certainly better than the dreary flatness of Illinois. 2 hours after leaving Denver, we reached the Colorado Plateau, and winding mountain rails gave way to a few ski resort stops in the gleaming white snow. We then left behind all signs of civilization, heading through some narrow valleys with frozen-over rivers and deeper into the Rocky Mountains. At this point, we lost cell signal for good, and would not regain it until well into the afternoon, when we had long passed the continental watershed, meaning that now the rivers we saw all would ultimately end up in the Pacific rather than the Atlantic. I was really lucky with the weather considering it was January. Absolutely gleaming sunshine. The mood on the train was good, people enjoying the views, the train conductors pointing out interesting sights, and I was curious to venture deeper into parts of the USA that I had never seen before, and likely never would see again. Little did I know at this point that some of the most interesting landscapes were yet to come. Building tracks through these mountains in the 19th and early 20th centuries must have been an insane task. The California Zephyr actually uses the highest bit of the Amtrak rail network in the US, the Moffat Tunnel, almost 3 kilometers, more than 9,000 feet above sea level. Travelers passed through it just before noon on the second day of the California Zephyr while ascending into the Rockies from Denver. As we inched westward, the color of the rocks started changing, a result of them being rich in iron oxide, also known as rust. These are some of the oldest rock formations in the world, dating about 1.7 billion years back to the Precambrian era. That's over a billion years before even the first fish started existing on Earth. Eventually, at about 4 p.m., we rolled into Grand Junction, Colorado, our first stop in many hours. Here, most of the Amish people who had been traveling with us since Chicago left the train. A cursory Google search told me that Colorado is somewhat of a western frontier for Amish settlement, but I am by no means an expert. The next part of the trip, chasing the sunset, really turned the scenery up to 11. We passed through deep red and orange landscapes and canyons, past abandoned telegraph lines that once would have connected the most remote outposts of the American West to slightly less remote regional hubs. Back in the day, when the train network was used by settlers moving out west in search of gold, or in search of oil, or simply in search of a different life. We reached the final boss of the prehistoric landscapes, the fittingly named Ruby Canyon, right at peak sunset. Having passed the canyon, we were now in Utah and in the depth of the desert, so different from Chicago's urban bustle. We even passed some ghost towns along the way, settlements once full of optimism that had failed to ever really get off the ground. It felt like we were taking a train across the surface of the moon or Mars. Eventually, the sun set over this alien landscape and our train rumbled off into the pitch blackness of a Utah desert night. On day 3, we awoke somewhere in northern Nevada, still in the desert, but the snow had made a comeback. I was thrilled, however, to see real tumbleweeds for the first time in my life, and hoped that I might see one rolling in the wind. Spoiler alert, I did not. Guess I'll have to come back. What I did see were snow-capped mountains, not what I had expected from Nevada, and more abandoned mining towns. Our next big scheduled stop was Reno, but it was still several hours away, and until then, the sky and mountains put on a spectacular show full of surprising colors. Leaving Nevada behind, we made our way up yet another mountain range and across the state line into what was, surprisingly, the snowiest state of them all so far, California. My destination now seemed near, but it would still be several more hours and a major change in scenery until San Francisco. One important scenery change was the passing of Lake Donner. It was here that, in the winter of 1846, a group of American pioneers coming, like us, from the Midwest, were trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains by the onset of winter. They had to wait for warmer weather, and in the process, many perished, and those that lived partly had to resort to cannibalism to make it through. Today, travelers to California can just cruise past in their comfortable, cushioned seats. Eventually, and surprisingly suddenly, the snow vanished and revealed the ochre-red soil of inland California, and first signs of civilization after days of traveling through sparsely populated land. I was shocked to see how many wrecked cars lay in the forests near our route, and even more saddened by how many of these mechanical carcasses seemed to serve as homes for people who evidently couldn't afford to live in America's cities. The stark contrast of abject poverty next to the tracks and gleaming skyscrapers became ever more jarring as we descended into the Central Valley and approached the capital of California, Sacramento, although the fleeting glimpses of despair were hard to capture on camera. The Central Valley was flat, really very flat, and it actually brought us well below sea level after having spent days in the mountains. It was also very sunny, and I started to think I should have maybe brought some sunscreen with me on the train. The train had emptied out almost completely by now, and a few hours later we were in the Bay Area, mere minutes away from our final destination in Emeryville. After passing some impressive oil industry, the weather decided in the last minute to flip. I really didn't want to have to put up with rain as I didn't have an accommodation booked in San Francisco. Luckily, the concerns proved unfounded, and minutes later we pulled into our final stop. A quick shuttle bus brought the few remaining passengers across the bay and right into downtown San Francisco, with a spectacular view, might I add. My more than 50-hour train journey had come to an end. Coach class had started feeling like home, and I had learned a lot about the wonderful but flawed country that is the US. It's an unforgettable adventure that I would recommend, and have repeatedly done so, to anybody who is able to undertake it. Even if sitting in coach for 3 days and spending 2 nights without a bed is a challenge in and of itself. For me, the challenge was not yet over. I would have a 3rd night without a bed, for I only had about 4 hours to explore San Francisco before heading to the airport. I had booked a flight back to Chicago for the very evening I arrived, for the simple reason that I had class in the morning. It worked out in the end, as it started pouring shortly before my time in SF was up, but, luckily, shortly after I had seen all the sites that I wanted to revisit. The airport was deserted, a stark reminder that even if vaccines were beginning to go into arms, COVID was not yet vanquished. After a flight too short to get proper rest, I arrived back in Chicago, 60 hours after I had left. I waited in the cold for the train to take me home, swiped into my room, and got ready for class. Hey, thank you for watching my video. It's the first time that I've attempted to create something like this, and I am painfully aware that it has many rough edges, but hope you enjoyed coming on this journey with me regardless. In the future, I hope to make some more content like this, and maybe some other more explainer-style videos, so feel free to subscribe, it's free after all. Also, feel free to check out some of my other stuff on the internet at linktree.com/Linus_AT.